Each senator, when his or her name is called, will stand in his or her place and vote guilty or not guilty as required by Rule 23 of the Senate Rules on Impeachment. Article 1, Section 3, Clause 6 of the Constitution regarding the vote required for conviction on impeachment provides that no person shall be convicted without the concurrence of 2/3 of the members present. The question is on the first article of impeachment. Senators, how say you? Is the respondent, Donald John Trump, guilty or not guilty? A roll call vote is required. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Not guilty.
Mr. Alexander, not guilty. Ms. Baldwin.
Guilty.
Ms. Baldwin, guilty. Mr. Barrasso.
Not guilty.
Mr. Barrasso, not guilty. Mr. Bennett.
Guilty.
Mr. Bennett, guilty. Mrs. Blackburn.
Not guilty.
Mrs. Blackburn, not guilty. Mr. Blumenthal.
Guilty.
Mr. Blumenthal, guilty. Mr. Blunt.
Not guilty.
Mr. Blunt, not guilty. Mr. Booker.
Guilty.
Mr. Booker, guilty. Mr. Bozeman.
Not guilty.
Mr. Bozeman, not guilty. Mr. Braun.
Not guilty.
Mr. Braun, not guilty. Mr. Brown.
Guilty.
Mr. Brown, guilty. Mr. Burr.
Not guilty.
Mr. Burr, not guilty. Ms. Cantwell. Ms. Cantwell, guilty. Mrs. Capito. Mrs. Capito, not guilty. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Cardin, guilty. Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper, guilty. Mr. Casey. Mr. Casey, guilty. Mr. Cassidy.
Not guilty.
Mr. Cassidy, not guilty. Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins, not guilty. Mr. Coons.
Guilty.
Mr. Coons, guilty. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cornyn, not guilty. Ms. Cortez Masto. Ms. Cortez Masto, guilty. Mr. Cotton.
Not guilty.
Mr. Cotton, not guilty. Mr. Kramer.
Not guilty.
Mr. Kramer, not guilty. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Crapo, not guilty. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Cruz, not guilty. Mr. Daines.
Not guilty.
Mr. Daines, not guilty. Ms. Duckworth. Ms. Duckworth, guilty. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Durbin, guilty. Mr. Enzi. Mr. Enzi, not guilty. Ms. Ernst. Ms. Ernst, not guilty. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein, guilty. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Fisher, not guilty. Mr. Gardner. Mr. Gardner, not guilty. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mrs. Gillibrand, guilty. Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham, not guilty. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Grassley, not guilty. Ms. Harris. Ms. Harris, guilty. Ms. Hassan. Ms. Hassan, guilty. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Hawley, not guilty. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Heinrich, guilty. Ms. Hirono. Ms. Hirono, guilty. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven, not guilty. Mrs. Hyde-Smith.
Not guilty.
Mrs. Hyde-Smith, not guilty. Mr. Inhofe.
Not guilty.
Mr. Inhofe, not guilty. Mr. Johnson.
Not guilty.
Mr. Johnson, not guilty. Mr. Jones.
Guilty.
Mr. Jones, guilty. Mr. Kane.
Guilty.
Mr. Kane, guilty. Mr. Kennedy.
Not guilty.
Mr. Kennedy, not guilty. Mr. King.
Guilty.
Mr. King, guilty. Ms. Klobuchar? Ms. Klobuchar, guilty. Mr. Langford? Mr. Langford, not guilty. Mr. Leahy? Mr. Leahy, guilty. Mr. Lee?
Not guilty.
Mr. Lee, not guilty. Mrs. Loeffler? Mrs. Loeffler, not guilty. Mr. Manchin? Mr. Manchin, guilty. Mr. Markey? Mr. Markey, guilty. Mr. McConnell? Mr. McConnell, not guilty. Ms. McSally? Ms. McSally, not guilty. Mr. Menendez? Mr. Menendez, guilty. Mr. Merkley? Mr. Merkley, guilty. Mr. Moran? Mr. Moran, not guilty. Ms. Murkowski? Ms. Murkowski, not guilty. Mr. Murphy? Mr. Murphy, guilty. Mrs. Murray? Mrs. Murray, guilty. Mr. Paul? Mr. Paul, not guilty. Mr. Perdue? Mr. Perdue, not guilty. Mr. Peters? Mr. Peters, guilty. Mr. Portman? Mr. Portman, not guilty. Mr. Reed? Mr. Reed, guilty. Mr. Risch? Mr. Risch, not guilty. Mr. Roberts? Mr. Roberts, not guilty. Mr. Romney? Mr. Romney, guilty. Ms. Rosen? Ms. Rosen, guilty. Mr. Rounds? Mr. Rounds, not guilty. Mr. Rubio? Mr. Rubio, not guilty. Mr. Sanders? Mr. Sanders, guilty. Mr. Sass? Mr. Sass, not guilty. Mr. Schatz? Mr. Schatz, guilty. Mr. Schumer? Mr. Schumer, guilty. Mr. Scott of Florida? Mr. Scott of Florida, not guilty. Mr. Scott of South Carolina? Mr. Scott of South Carolina, not guilty. Mrs. Shaheen? Mrs. Shaheen, guilty. Mr. Shelby? Mr. Shelby, not guilty. Ms. Sinema? Ms. Sinema, guilty. Ms. Smith? Ms. Smith, guilty. Ms. Stabenow? Ms. Stabenow, guilty. Mr. Sullivan? Mr. Sullivan, not guilty. Mr. Tester? Mr. Tester, guilty. Mr. Thune? Mr. Thune, not guilty. Mr. Tillis? Mr. Tillis, not guilty. Mr. Toomey? Mr. Toomey, not guilty. Mr. Udall? Mr. Udall, guilty. Mr. Van Hollen? Mr. Van Hollen, guilty. Mr. Warner? Mr. Warner, guilty. Ms. Warren? Ms. Warren, guilty. Mr. Whitehouse? Mr. Whitehouse, guilty. Mr. Wicker? Mr. Wicker, not guilty. Mr. Wyden? Mr. Wyden, guilty. Mr. Young? Mr. Young, not guilty.
On this article of impeachment, 48 senators have pronounced Donald John Trump, President of the United States, guilty as charged. 52 senators have pronounced him not guilty as charged. Two-thirds of the senators present not having pronounced him guilty, the Senate adjudges that the respondent, Donald John Trump, President of the United States, is not guilty as charged in the first article of impeachment.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.